Hi, everybody. I'm Karen Hartglass, and you're listening to It's All About Food. Thank you for joining me today.
Great.
I get excited when I talk about books that I really think are important and that everyone should read. And we're going to be talking about a book called Will Work for Food Labor Across the Food Chain today, written by Laura Ann Minkoff-Zern and Teresa Mares.
Mhm.
And I have Teresa Mares with me today. Let me tell you a little bit about her. Teresa Mares is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Vermont and affiliated faculty in food systems. Her research and teaching examines food labor, food movements, and immigration from Latin America to the U.S. Dr. Mares has years of experience collaborating with activists in food and labor justice movements. Her first book, Life on the Other Border, Farm Workers and Food Justice in Vermont, was published by University of California Press in 2019. She has also published widely in journals like Agriculture and Human Values, Food and Foodways, and the Journal of Agriculture, Food Systems, and Community Development. She earned a PhD in anthropology with a graduate certificate in women's studies from the University of Washington. She lives in Charlotte, Vermont with her partner, daughter, and two pups.
Yep. Hopefully we don't hear those two pups too much.
Okay, it's okay if we do. We welcome them on this program, and we welcome you, Teresa. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me.
Okay, so I think I was saying before, everyone who eats,
Mhm.
everyone who eats food should read this book.
Oh, thank you. I hope so. I hope that that's the case.
All humans who eat food. I'm not sure about, the non-human animals, how good they are with reading and listening to our crazy languages, but at least every human who eats food, and that means everyone,
Yeah.
should know the history of where our
Yeah.
food comes from.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that that's the audience that we had in mind.
Everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we look at these labor dimensions in the food system, it's really important that we acknowledge and come to terms with those lives that are really connected to our own, in all of the different parts of the food system. And that was a goal for these for this book, was to make it really accessible and much more public facing than our two previous books were, which were a little bit more academic in nature.
Hmm. Well, in some ways it is academic. We do get a lot of statistics, a lot of numbers here and there, but it's a very readable story that can touch anyone who has a heart, a soul. I don't know. Maybe some people wouldn't care, but I think most people would be moved by many of the stories you tell and much of the information that is shared.
Yeah.
Sometimes on this program, I talk about taking a deep breath and just breathing in the good and letting go whatever's making us anxious. These are very difficult times, and maybe all through
Yes.
humans' existence, it's been challenging in one way or another. But one of the things that I often like to do when I'm sitting down for a meal is to think about where the food came from on my plate.
Yeah, me too.
And it's amazing to think about the hundreds of thousands of people that might have been affected in bringing the sweet potato to your plate or the lettuce, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
There's really so many people involved. And I don't think I appreciated it even as much as I was trying to until I read Will Work for Food Labor Across the Food Chain.
Yeah, I mean, that was really our guiding question that we were thinking through. And, the one that guided the kind of research that we did, what kinds of statistics we brought in was this question of like, who are the actual hands that are touching our food, right? And we have millions of people employed in the food industry, from these frontline workers that we're really focusing on to, very high paid CEOs within, large scale agri-food corporations. But our question was really like, who are those frontline workers that we are interacting with through the things that come onto our plate, or those that have to deal with the food that we don't eat or that we waste as well.
Each chapter goes through different areas of the food system, different industries that are related to food somehow. And we learn about the exploitation,
Mm.
the poor pay, the the accidents.
Mhm.
It's just, it's one sad story after the next. But you also like to bring in organizations that are working to make each of these different situations better.
Yep.
So
Yep.
there is some balance there, there is some hope, and there's always many things that we can do. I just wanted to share a few little stories before we dig into some of the real nitty gritty of it all.
Sure.
Um, Food is important to all of us. And, you know, we in the United States, we have the holiday Thanksgiving, and we have these romantic images of everyone sitting around the table and breaking bread and enjoying a meal. And in today's world, sitting around a table isn't
Mhm.
as popular as it used to be. Everybody's on their own schedule. Many people eat fast food in their cars or on their way to one place or another or in school or wherever they may eat. And that around the table, I think it's very important that families come
Right.
together at least for one meal around the table, but it's not as prevalent as it used to be.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's hard. Yeah, it's hard to do
it's
so.
hard. Um, my dad, he died about 8 years ago, and he loved going out to restaurants. And we would sit at a restaurant, and he would always like to be friends with the servers. He would like to flirt with the younger women, maybe not so acceptable in these
That
times, but he was
Sounds
always
like my
very
dad.
friendly. And he'd like, hi there, and he'd like to give his name when they gave their name, and it was all
Mm.
very sweet and lovely until something went wrong.
Oh, yeah.
And that was a trigger for him. If he didn't get exactly what he wanted, we all cringed. It was a disaster, and he could be really nasty.
Yeah.
And we would joke about that a lot with him. But what I always used to tell him was, you should work as a waiter
Yeah.
just for a day,
Yeah, I think
or
that's a good point.
because you have no idea what is on the other side.
Yep.
You have no idea.
Yep. And I think that that's part of the initial interest that we had in this book is that both Laura Ann and I have worked in the food system and that, in her case, she was a server. In my case, I did a few different jobs, but I think for us to have an understanding and empathy for those workers, for us to become better tippers, it's often having that experience in what can be really, really challenging work.
Yeah. I mean, just in a restaurant, I always say that anybody who opens a restaurant, it's a very difficult thing to do. So, my heart goes out to the person who's trying to have a restaurant, but you need a big workforce around you,
Yep.
and it's expensive. The food's expensive. Everything's expensive. The rent's expensive. The permits are expensive. And you don't want to pay your workers very much.
Yeah, or you can't. And I think that that's what we try to dig into a little bit is that it's often not a question of will or interest or desire, but I think that when you look across the food system, whether you're looking at service or agricultural work, right, labor is often the most squeezable, right, within certain policy guidelines and minimum wage guidelines. But, you can't necessarily tell your supplier, no, I won't pay this for the bell peppers, right? Or I won't pay this for rent. Whereas labor is one of the few things that can be squeezed, right, at the discretion of, whether it's a farm owner, a restaurant owner, a composting facility owner, that's the squeezable piece often.
It's just mind blowing, but this is reality, right?
Yep.
And then the other thing I just wanted to bring up, you kind of touch on it in the book, but I see myself as relatively privileged.
Hmm.
I grew up in a middle class home. I had a mother and a father, a sister and a brother. I was
Hmm.
never hungry. I
Yep.
always had a home. They would complain about money, and I didn't always have all the extras that some of my friends would have, but I had everything I needed.
Yeah.
And I went to college.
Mhm.
I studied chemical engineering. I
Wow.
went off and, worked in the industry for some 20 years before I got into the nonprofit world and activism. But when I was in college and in high school, I did work as a server.
Hmm.
And and I'm also an actor. So for me,
Yeah.
it was kind of like a part I was playing.
Yeah. I think it draws certain skills and talents. Yeah.
Skill is the key word here.
Yeah. Yep.
And I know a lot of people don't take working as a server in a restaurant seriously. It's like my actor friends, they call it their survivor job or whatever it is. But I think any job we do, we
Mhm.
should do it with integrity. We should do it with respect.
Yep.
And it's paying you something. And it's not, it's, it's just, I don't like the way some of these jobs are perceived to some
Yeah.
people who don't have to do that work.
Sure. And I think that I mean, that's one of another main point that we try to raise is that, we call a lot of the jobs in the food system unskilled, right? And that couldn't be further than the truth. I think if any
Hmm.
of us have, tried to grow our own food or tried to cook a meal or tried to wait tables, that there's a tremendous amount of skill in that. And a point that we raise is that this isn't about skill, it's about the way we value these jobs, right? And the way that they're either stigmatized or the way that they're assigned, prestige or a lack of prestige in our society. And it isn't a lack of skill, it's a lack of social value. And I think that when we come to terms with that, we hopefully will see more valuation, both kind of the social cultural valuation, but also the economic valuation of these jobs.
You wrote in the introduction, the U.S. food system is founded on slavery's legacy, as well as the enclosure of native land and the forced removal of indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
And so much of the United States, our successes, our
Mhm.
wealth,
Yeah.
are built on that exploitation.
Absolutely. Yep. And I think that goes within food and agriculture, but so many industries, right?
It's across the board, but I think it's, as you point out in this book, primarily the food industry.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's where, I'm an anthropologist. Anthropologists really love to think about history in different ways, and Laura Ann is a geographer who also is really historically informed. And so I think one of the opportunities that we had in this book was to really educate ourselves about these histories that, we teach them to students, we think about them with our students, but really getting into, those details of how wealth has been built and lands have been taken, and all of this is a question of power between different groups, different social groups. We really dug into that, and I think, I learned a ton through doing the research for this book. Some really sad histories that we
Mm.
have within the United States, but also I think the histories, what you're pointing to earlier, the histories of worker organizing and the histories of people coming together to challenge some of this exploitation are also really in need of us to understand because they can be models for what worker organizing or collectivism can look like.
Your book is coming out on September 23rd,
Yeah,
right?
technically. I know
Yeah,
the
which is very
copies are in the
exciting.
mail.
Uh, I can't help but think about our current federal government here in the United States while reading this book and reading the history and reading about all the activism and the great organizations that have made change,
Mhm.
positive change. And we need a lot more of that to be
Yep.
done. And I'm seeing now it looks like we have leaders who want to go backwards
Mhm.
and who want to rest on their privilege and really focus on this system we have of squeezing, like you said before, and paying the minimal amount we can to the most people we can. It's sort of like a different form of slavery in some way.
Yeah, and I think, some really true forms of indentured work. And yeah, I think that, looking at this book, the timing of it is interesting. And I think, had we not had some of our own internal deadlines, we could have never finished, right? Because I think that there could be a very big postscript about what our current federal administration means for food and farm workers and how, ongoing attacks on immigrant workers, whether they're in kitchens or on farms or, in my neighboring state of New York at, I think it was a protein bar or like some kind of a bar manufacturing facility that we're seeing a particularly heightened criminalization and attack on the very workers that we're talking about in this book. And it's a really frightening time, not only for those workers, but for what that means for all of our reliance on a stable food system.
You wrote early in the book, according to 2018-20 data from the National Agriculture Workers Survey, 70% of farm workers are foreign born,
Hmm.
and roughly 41% work without authorization.
Yep. And those numbers are hard to come to, right? And the NAS data, the National Agricultural Worker Survey, those data are as good as they can be. That when we look at the number of foreign-born workers, that includes both workers who come through things like the H-2A visa program, but we have so many other farm workers who are not protected by any kind of an agricultural visa.
And we know when you're not protected,
Hmm.
you're going to tolerate a lot more injustice.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's something that, that precarity of workers, whether it's again, restaurant workers or agricultural workers, that documentation or citizenship does come with it a number of protections, but it also comes, on the flip side, like you're pointing to, if you aren't protected by that, a toleration or, not even a toleration, but a forced acceptance of pay abuse and, wage theft and sexual harassment and sexual abuse that has been very well documented within agriculture. And that's really distressing that persists in the places that are feeding us.
This idea of skilled versus unskilled, I want to dig into this a little more because it's really important.
Hmm.
I don't know how many people have a backyard garden or have tried to grow some food. I know some people are disasters when it comes to keeping a plant.
Myself included.
The way nature has made it, food really should just grow naturally and we could go and harvest as we need, but civilization has gotten a little unwieldy and we need to focus on growing food to feed everybody.
Yep.
It's not necessarily easy. It requires skill.
Hmm.
And there's so many different kinds of farming today. I'm not a fan of monocropping, and
Yeah.
I don't care about the skill required to make acres and acres and acres and acres of alfalfa. I'm not interested in that. But to grow a wide variety of crops, because we need a wide variety of food,
Yep.
takes a lot of skill.
It does take a lot of skill. Yeah.
And you note in the book that the Africans that were brought to the
Mhm.
United States as slaves had that skill,
Yep.
at least with the food that they were used to growing.
Hmm.
And I've also seen that Mexicans that come in through the south of our country have these skills, skills that we don't have
Or that we've lost.
or we've lost.
Yep.
Right, the Native Americans had it.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that that's where, we get into some of the literature and our own experiences that, both Laura Ann and I work with farm workers. In my case, my first book was focused on dairy farm workers, and Laura Ann has looked at workers of multiple kinds, but mostly more crop agriculture. And, when we look at the reason that certain regions of Africa were targeted, it's because of that agricultural knowledge that they had. And there's amazing books on that, Black Rice being one that we cite. A lot of Michael Twitty's work looks at that as well. And, we know that a lot of the farm workers from Latin America that we now have in the United States are coming from regions that are still very actively farming or where subsistence agriculture is within sort of the collective memory, if not actively being practiced. And I think that that's where there's the valuation of this skill that it takes, but also, this is about racialization. And if the workers who have that knowledge, right, are cast in a certain way as less than or as devalued, then that knowledge also becomes devalued. And I think that that is really unfortunate, not only for basic humanitarian reasons, but because as we look at these challenges of climate change, of political instability, of all of these things that are confronting us, we need that knowledge and skill in order for our food system to be resilient.
Hmm. So I'm a vegan for 37 years.
Hmm.
And this is one of the things that I have done because I can't do anything else. It's just my belief system says you're not killing non-human animals.
Hmm.
But when it comes to laws, and we need policy, we
Yeah.
need laws because in a capitalistic society, those that have are going to be squeezing as much as they can to get as much as they can.
Yep.
And so we need these laws. And we have had some good laws put on the books. And you spoke about the New Deal
Hmm.
and how it tried to have legislation with labor reforms.
Yep.
And yet, what I found was interesting, and I find I'm always trying to connect the dots between people and animals. Um, there are these exclusionary laws that
Mhm.
exclude some people or some
Yep.
people working in some industries. And we do that with food animals as well. We have animal laws that protect some animals, but not
Hmm.
the ones we want to eat.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can
And
you talk
those,
about exclusionary laws, at least for people?
sure, yeah, those, yeah, we could go anthropologically, what we choose and choose not to consume in terms of animals is really interesting. But I think that, one of the points, and we're building upon other scholars here who have traced this history as well, is that when we look at the New Deal protections, which were really important protections for workers in the United States, right? The right for collective bargaining, a number of different pay requirements. The two main industries that were left out of those protections were agricultural workers and domestic workers. And there's a somewhat sordid history of why those were excluded. Part of it was that we were trying to get the buy-in of Southern representatives at that time to agree to those
Mm,
policy changes.
of
And at
course.
that time in the South, a lot of those jobs were being done by Black workers. And so keeping them excluded was a way of keeping the status quo, right? And especially in a segregated South, keeping the social order as those in power wanted it to be. How that then traces to current day with those protections still excluded, or those classes, those categories of workers being excluded, is now agricultural workers of multiple ethnic backgrounds are not receiving those protections, um, both in agricultural work and domestic work. And so, looking at that history of policy and how laws are passed, right, we can't separate that from racial hierarchies and racial segregation that is persistent, and then how it changes as demographics change is really interesting. But yeah, we go back to the New Deal in a lot of ways as an important movement and time for worker protections, but that didn't apply to everybody. And those things are still on the books.
Back to de-skills or
Hmm.
unskilled and de-skilling.
Hmm. Two different
Uh,
things. Yep.
yeah, it's not, I don't think I've ever said that before, de-skilling,
Hmm.
but we should be talking about it.
Yeah, and it's, that's where we have people like Henry Ford to thank, right? And Henry Ford and what he did with his assembly line model, which then, also brought in ideas of scientific management, was a project of trying to make more things with people who could be more easily replaced, right? And when we break down something that might be, very difficult, like butchering an animal, right? That previously would have been done more of like a nose to tail process with one person knowing each of the steps and how to do that. And while we still have that in a small sense in the United States, most of animal production and processing is done on an assembly line. And so when you de-skill a job, you break it down into something that is very monotonous, that might be very challenging, from a ergonomics perspective, right? Doing the same kind of cut, multiple thousand times a day. But what that de-skilling does is it turns a job that requires a lot of skill and knowledge into something that is spread out across an assembly line. And then those workers are much more easily replaced, right? Because you only have to train them to do that one small thing. And so that's something that we see not only in food, but in so much assembly line production. And it's an intentional process, right? It's an intentional process to make lots of things very quickly with workers who are, in some cases sort of disposable.
Mhm. And this keeps a large group of people down
Yep.
and poorly paid
Hmm.
and not really able to fight for themselves.
Yeah. And
And
it keeps a constant food supply, right? I think that that's another thing is that we don't often think about, I don't like to think about monoculture, but we have to. Like, we have to think about farming at all sizes because of population demands and the ways that we choose to eat. And, when we look at early days of the COVID pandemic, one of the things that we write about are these executive orders that kept the meatpacking facilities open, right, as nation's critical infrastructure
mhm.
because of that tight dependence upon what those factories are producing. And we all have a role in factory production, whether it's meat or whether it's something else. And it's critical to the food supply of our country.
Yeah, we need to make a lot of changes. Now, my personal background, I want all slaughterhouses to go away. I want
Mhm.
people to stop eating animals. And I
Yep.
think we would benefit uh, for many reasons if
Hmm.
we at least reduce the amount of animals we were consuming.
Yep.
I mean, we even know with COVID, many studies have come out since that the people that fared the best with COVID were the ones that were eating primarily plants.
Yeah.
So there's kind of like it one bad thing touches another. It's a horrifying industry. It's probably of all of the industries out there for humans, for workers, it's got the highest accident rate and it's probably one of the most dangerous.
Mhm.
But it's also raising animals for food. It's bad for the environment. It's bad for our health, and it's certainly bad for the animals. So,
I think in the way that we do it, right? In the
yep.
mainstream way, absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
but again, connecting the dots.
Hmm.
um, those in power that
Hmm.
own these industries, they don't
Yep.
care what we do with animals,
Not
and they
really.
don't care what we do with the people who are bringing the products
Yeah.
to the people.
Yep.
They just
And they
don't
have a
care.
lot of influence on policy making, right? I think when you look at
Yes, absolutely.
this revolving door between large agri-food companies and the policies that are being sort of made to regulate them, there's a lot of crossover there.
So I've never been a fan of the assembly line concept. The word efficiency is probably one of my least favorite words because of how it connects with capitalism. But I know how people love convenience. So we have efficiency, we have convenience. Is there a way, and I'm not expecting you to even know this, but is there a way that we can feed the world without assembly lines, or at least I know we're going to robotics too to some
Oh yeah.
degree,
Yeah.
but without craft.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really challenging. And I think, when we look at that, and yeah, that I can't answer that question in an hour because we have lots of people thinking about that. But, what I think about, I always come back to some of the work by people like Raj Patel, right, in Stuffed and Starved, where we have enough food to feed, I think in his book, he estimated 12 billion people. It's a problem of distribution. And so, I think we need all kinds of agriculture, right? Small, medium, and large. I think we need robust distribution systems. But I also think, we need to look more broadly than just the food system. So one of the things that we try to address in this book is it's also about the work that happens in the home, right? And Laura
Mm.
Ann and I are both mothers. We both have kids to feed. We both have full-time jobs. We both have, very supportive partners who have a role in that as well. But I think it's important to think about what are the broader systems that are making it so that convenience food is needed, right? We have increasing housing prices, we have increasing healthcare costs, we have all of these other systems that our food system connects to. And there's a real need for convenience because of all of those other pressures. And, there's some benefits that come when other people are cooking for us or other people are growing food for us, right? I can spend my time writing a book and not trying to grow a garden, which honestly I would be writing. But it comes at expenses, right? And it comes at costs for lots of different things. And that question of how do we feed, billions of people around the world, I think it takes lots of different kinds of solutions, but we can do it. It's a problem of waste, there's a problem of maldistribution, and I think it's also a problem of wrong incentives for disastrous models of growing food, right? And we do certainly need more climate smart and culturally smart uh, options to do so.
I was amused when I was reading about the change to self-service groceries.
Yeah.
So this happened, what, over 100 years ago or so,
Hmm. Hmm.
where people used to go to a store
Yep.
and talk to a person who would pick the things that they
Yep.
wanted and give it to them.
Yep.
And it was funny to me because I read that and I reacted to it like, "Oh, I wouldn't want that."
Yeah.
I was happy when we finally got ATMs and I didn't have to deal with a bank teller. I mean, what does that say?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it says that we do want our socializing where we want it, right? And
Socializing's very important, but
yeah,
where we want it.
but how do we enact our own choice and agency about going into a grocery store? One of the things that I talked about in other research of mine is that a lot of my work has looked at food security for farm workers themselves and how do farm workers in a state like Vermont get food when they're often not traveling off of those farms. Oftentimes it's having other people do their shopping, right? And that can be a letting go, like often a reluctant letting go of choice and agency. And one of the
Hmm.
things that we like about grocery stores is our ability to go in and make those choices, on our own terms at 11:30 at night, those 24-hour stores, right, to
Right.
do that kind of work. I also think that, looking at the history of grocery stores, one of the reasons that there was a movement, a welcome movement away from those stores where you had to ask a shopkeeper is for Black Americans. Having to do that was a site of discomfort and racial power, right? So when you're able to go in and do your own shopping, having to negotiate with that shopkeeper is a different process, and that was
Mm.
welcomed by many. And so it points to who are we as shoppers, who are, other people as workers. And, those are intense social negotiations sometimes.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about a lot of people today who like to use services
Hmm.
where they have a shopper. They
Yeah.
might dial up online what they want and somebody
Yep.
else picks it out.
Yeah.
It's personally not for me.
I love going grocery shopping, so it's not for me either.
And interesting too, I've gone to farmers markets in the United States. Uh, I don't find them, they're not the same as the ones I find in Europe. I
Yeah.
lived in France for a time and I always enjoyed talking to the
Hmm.
people there, the farmers, discussing all the food. And there was so much that came with the food, the culture and the weather and
Hmm.
everything else. I don't know, it's not, maybe I haven't found the right farmers market, but
Have you been to Vermont's farmers markets
there
there?
you go.
Vermont has some great farmers
I'm
markets.
sure it's different in different places. Yeah. So I guess it depends on the situation, where we want to
Yeah.
interact. Like you said before, we can choose our socializing.
And the cultural history of like how, I've lived in Mexico for some time, and there, you don't buy for 2 weeks at a time typically, or there's been a movement away from that or a movement towards that for some and away from that from some. But, going to the market every day to get what's fresh and what's just been prepared is much more of a daily routine, right? And I think that, these are all cultural practices that we engage in. And sometimes it takes us traveling to a different place to be like, oh, the way that we do things is not the only way, and it can look like this. And, that's why I'm an anthropologist, because I like to think about different ways of of
Hmm.
solving your problems.
All right, let's talk about Amazon.
Yeah, we can talk about Amazon.
And isn't it funny that they chose that name,
Yeah, it is. I
Amazon?
used to live right below the Amazon building in Seattle, and it was, yeah.
I mean, for an anthropologist,
Yeah.
especially.
Yep.
Okay, you wrote in an analysis of data submitted by Amazon to OSHA, the worker injury rate at Amazon warehouse facilities increased 20% from
Mhm.
2020 to 2021. In that same year, Amazon workers sustained 49% of total warehouse injuries nationwide, despite employing only one third of warehouse workers.
Yeah. And I think when you look at that, the pressure to work so quickly, right? The pressure to work long hours to deliver things at crazy speed. I live in rural Vermont. When I order something from Amazon, which I don't really do anymore, but when I
Yep,
did, it would take days to get here, right? But when I'm in an urban context, like I can order something and it's there immediately. And so
immediately.
that speed really makes it an unsafe working place. And then, beyond Amazon distribution, Amazon's entrance into grocery, whether it's through Whole Foods or whether it's through Amazon Fresh, that, it is a behemoth organization that controls so much of our food system, and immense amounts of profit at the top, right?
Yeah,
It's
I think
mind,
that's the biggest point.
yeah,
Okay, people at the top are making ridiculous, obscene amounts of money that nobody can do anything with other than obtain more power.
yeah,
And then all these people that work for you are barely surviving.
yeah,
And that absolutely has to change. Our current administration is not at all interested in changing that. They want to make it worse. They want to privatize everything and make it more so, which is rather disturbing.
yeah.
But with Amazon, I I don't have an Amazon account anymore. I really, really, really try not to buy from Amazon. But as a vegan,
Mhm.
for decades, I have enjoyed going to health food stores.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
some of them have been really lovely experiences. The small ones, especially, just
Hmm.
like some of the vegan restaurants I've experienced, the owners really believe in what they're doing and they have heart in the business. Excuse me. And all right, I'm gonna have to cut my hacking out here. So I used to enjoy these small health food stores, and then they became a little bigger, which
Hmm.
in some days was great, in some
Yeah.
ways because there was more variety.
Yep.
And then these bigger health food stores, Big Apple Circus, and I can't even remember some of the names of them anymore, but they all got gobbled up by Whole Foods.
Hmm.
They gobbled up every one of them.
Yeah.
And okay, so I was shopping at Whole Foods
Hmm.
and it was still okay. They had a great selection of organic produce and some of the other stuff that I was interested in. And then they became Amazon, and the quality has gone down significantly.
Yeah.
And I know that I don't want to support them, not just because of the quality, but also because of the company and how
Yeah.
they treat their workers and what they pay their workers.
Yeah, and I think that that's, it's really, the overall pattern within our food system is one of consolidation and concentration, right? Philip Howard wrote it best, power, or what is it? Sitting right here, power and concentration in the food system, right? That when you look at retail, when you look at, grocery as part of retail, when you look at restaurants, when you look at agriculture, right? We have fewer options. And a lot of times we have fewer options because these larger players are, taking over. We talk about in the book, the case of dollar stores, right? Dollar
Mm.
stores are everywhere. And when you have very few options, whether you're in a rural community or whether because of economics you have few options, right? That we often have no choice but to go to these very consolidated and concentrated companies. And what's lost in doing that, right, is a lot. It's protection of maybe those relationships with small local farmers. It's certainly labor costs, but it's it's one of these things that I think, again, going back to some work by Raj Patel, right? We have this illusion of choice, but really our choices are set out for us by so many companies with so much power.
I live in New York City, and just back to Amazon for a moment, the delivery scene here is obscene. Okay, our building alone, we now have a package room, which we didn't
Yeah.
need before, but it's just become so crazy that we need a safe place to put our packages. Everybody wants delivery and everybody wants it now, and there's nowhere to park
Hmm.
for these delivery vans. And then
Hmm.
we have the delivery food workers, the ones on these little electric things.
Yep.
And I don't know how they do what they do, and it's so dangerous. It's dangerous for them, and they're always cutting people off because they have to get everywhere so fast. And it's just the whole scenario. Why do we need all this food delivered to us in an instant?
Oh, and I think so much of this we can also look at how COVID has accelerated a lot of things,
Mm.
right? That when we felt afraid of going to grocery shopping Instacart was our solution. When we felt afraid of even picking up food curbside, DoorDash was our option, right? And I think when you look at, especially we spend some time thinking about things like Uber Eats and Instacart and these delivery services that a lot of times the growth of these is again because of large companies that are making tremendous profits upon not actually hiring people, but by contracting workers and by shifting so many of those costs of labor onto independent contractors. And so it's again, I think we have to think about the broader economic system. And if rent is increasing maybe we have to do DoorDash for a few hours a month to make ends meet. And I think it's all, again, it is part of the food system, but it's about a broader economic system um, that is placing a lot of constraints on us every day.
I liked you wrote during the pandemic there were some labor shortages and
Hmm.
franchise owners struggled to fill those positions and were forced to fill undesirable overnight shifts themselves. Now, I I laugh, but at the same time they were struggling and I feel for those owners as well. It's the people at the top that are squeezing every little thing out of all of us that I don't feel
Yeah,
anything for except disdain.
yeah, yeah. And I think that it is. My partner works for a small company, a local company that is a restaurant company, a restaurant group, and it's been very hard to find. I think what the pandemic has done is it has made people realize there's lots of other options, right? And companies are having a hard time, large companies and small companies finding workers because when the train shifted and people found other kinds of work, some of that has stayed around, right?
Yeah,
And
I was curious about that. Where did those people go?
yeah.
Those food workers, where did they go to work?
That's a great question. I think we need more research on that. And I think that we found people doing some moving on to contract work, maybe moving from a
Mm.
restaurant job into doing more contract labor. But the change has been pretty significant. And we have seen things that you would never really expect happening. I know even driving around the small town that I live in, or next town, we don't have a lot in my town, but fast food organizations now, fast food restaurants now desperately hiring people and putting starting wages of $15 an hour. So like things have become very unpredictable, I think, in our food system and the employment overall. But this book started with us trying to come to terms with what was happening during COVID. We started writing it in 2020. We didn't have any idea that at that point it would be so much of a COVID project. We've tried to make it much more relevant to the moments beyond COVID. But it's interesting to think about what impact that period of time has had on our food system and employment within it. It's significant.
Well, one of the things, and you mentioned this in the book, is that some of us
Hmm.
had a greater appreciation
Yeah.
for what we started to call essential workers,
Yep.
people in the hospitals and people bringing food to our plates.
Hmm.
But we've kind of forgotten that now to some degree, sadly.
Yeah.
I also wanted to bring up maybe one more downer before we get to some possible
There's lots of
moments
downers to
of
talk about,
light.
unfortunately. Yeah.
Yeah, Walmart,
Yep.
another favorite organization. You wrote about a 2020 study by Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office, which reports to the Budget Committee of the United States Senate, found that Walmart, McDonald's, Amazon, Kroger, and Dollar General were among the top employers with employees receiving federal aid such as Medicaid and the Supplement Nutrition Assistance Program, otherwise known as food stamps. While the rate of the reported food insecurity overall in the United States is 12%, it is a shocking 55% among Walmart workers. Attention, Walmart shoppers, the workers here are starving and underpaid and poorly treated.
Yeah, and that's, I think that's something that has connected my work because I've both looked at food security and insecurity for farm workers, and then, this book goes beyond just farm labor, but that is the thing that is like the perennial piece of information that just makes me irate and dumbfounded is that food and farm workers are more likely to be hungry than the general population. And again, it's about the wages, right? There's been instances where companies will hold food drives for their own employees and then they face the backlash like, wait, why do they need a food drive? And that's, that's the thing is that we have, if we want to talk about subsidizing, if we want to talk about, who's footing the bill for this, that SNAP is an immensely important program, right? WIC is an immensely important program. But when we have large companies getting insanely rich by paying people so little that they qualify for federal assistance, like that is a problem. And people do not, go on Snap because it's,
Because they want to?
because they
Yeah.
want to, or because, I mean, there's so much stigma around it, and, less so in some degrees because of, the EBT system. But it is a really big problem when people are being paid poverty wages, and, they're seeking out support to supplement those wages because they are so poor.
You're right. Capitalism at its core is based on the squeezing of labor power from workers to the direct benefit of owners. Yet the way in which workers experience capitalistic production and their own exploitation is through intersectional identities of race, gender, sexuality, ability, and citizenship, and is related to historical processes.
Yeah.
That's the United States in a nutshell, everybody.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that, we came at this. I do have this background in women's studies, and, Laura Anna and I both are really interested in the intersections of race and gender and sexuality and class and all of these things that come together. And when you look at food workers, right, they're more likely to be people of color, they're more likely to be immigrants, they're more likely to be women, especially when we look at food service work and cafeteria work. And again, this comes back to questions of social value and social hierarchies. Um, and I think that that makes, these struggles for worker justice and the food system also struggles for racial justice and economic justice that, we need more connections across those movements.
Okay, something I thought was awesome. I'm like, Black Panthers,
Mhm.
yay! I remember growing up and I didn't know very much about them, and what was kind of filtered through my house was not very positive.
Yeah.
And so I'm always surprised to learn about what they were about and what they were trying to achieve and what great things they did. So you wrote school breakfast was not widely available until the 1960s when the Black Panthers, a comprehensive social movement for Black liberation, started feeding children free breakfast in
Yeah.
Oakland, California, as part of their social welfare efforts to get Black children out of poverty. while the federal government started a pilot free breakfast program simultaneously, it was not until the success of the Black Panthers program spread across the country and was subsequently dismantled by the FBI that the
Yeah.
government program took off.
Yeah. And that, I think that that's where we see these really fascinating histories of, in now in my child's school district in Vermont, we have universal school meals, which has been a hugely important piece of, support for families in our state, as well as free snacks and, free breakfast if people need it. And to look at the original inspiration for that, right? And the early modeling of that program with the Panthers is something that we all need to re-educate ourselves on the history of these kinds of approaches, and also how, like you said, the way that messaging of groups like the Panthers gets really twisted, right? And I think we can think about that right now, but it is a really important thing to think about where do these models for social support come from? What are their origins? And how can they be scaled up, to serve more children? I think that we do have success stories there.
Success stories. So the best organizations are there organizations that are really doing, you've mentioned a bunch in the book, but some that are really doing great things that we should
Mhm.
look into or support or learn from.
Yeah, I think, a good place to start is, our book is really indebted to the work of the Food Chain Workers Alliance. Both Laura Ann and I, the reason this book came about is because we both teach a class on food and labor. And we were frustrated because we didn't feel like we had the thing, like the textbook that we could use. And
So you
so
had to write it.
we had to write it. That was exactly what happened. And we were really dependent and still are dependent upon the work of the Food Chain Workers Alliance, which is a national group made up of dozens of more locally focused groups that work on food and farm work labor. So they're a really great place to start and to look at what they're doing. Restaurant Opportunity Center United, Rock United, has worked very hard within service work and trying to bring dignified working conditions and pay to restaurant and service workers. The Worker Driven Social Responsibility Network, which not people, but member groups like Migrant Justice here in Vermont, Coalition of Immokalee Workers, Venceremos in Arkansas. We have these really amazing worker organizations that are really starting from worker perspectives. I think that's really key is that workers know what dignified work means and what changes are needed. And groups like those are really starting work with those priorities and thinking about, okay, well, how do we center worker knowledge and perspective in any kind of reforms for better labor?
Should we cook at home?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we should. We should. And, yeah, and we should think about the gendered work that goes along with that. But I think we should cook at home. I think we also should make it so that, if people are cooking for our home, that they're doing that in dignified ways, right? And I think, cooking brings with it a lot of skill, a lot of privilege. Having a kitchen to cook in is something that not everybody, has. And so, yeah, I think, I'm not going to say we shouldn't cook at home. I don't think that's the question, but I think it's, how do we make sure that the people who are cooking for us, if we're not cooking for ourselves, are doing so with dignity?
hmm Everything is so complicated and so intertwined, and everything touches everything else. And I wonder what are some of the things as individuals that we can do. I know what I'm doing, but I'm reading this book and I'm like, is it really going to make a difference?
Yeah.
I'm not buying from Amazon. I don't support
Mhm.
slaughterhouses, and I buy organic. And you had a testimonial from Eric Schlosser at the beginning of your book, which it's great that he wrote what he wrote.
Yep.
Um, which I'm going to read the first sentence: eating organic, avoiding food additives, champion family farm, supporting animal rights. None of these worthy practices will make the American food system healthy.
Yeah. And I think, there's individual work that we can do. And I think, we all have our own decision about what we can and cannot do on an individual level. But the conclusion is where we get into some of those options, right? And some of them are pushing for policies, right? And throwing our power behind things like the fight for 15 and saying, we need guaranteed minimum wages that are livable.
And for restaurant workers
Yeah.
that are making below that and not making enough tips to make the 15, everybody, bottom line, should get a
Yeah.
minimum of 15.
Yeah. So I think that those are, we have our own actions as eaters and consumers, and especially when scaled up, that those can bring about change. But I think it's also looking at what is the right solution for the right problem, right? Is this something that needs policy and needs our voices as, representatives? Is this, or not representatives, but those who are represented? Is this something that needs changes in corporate purchasing behavior, which is really what the Fair Food Program and the Milk with Dignity program have built their campaigns around. Is this about choosing to consume differently? Is this about, making sure that the local organizations in our community are funded if we have the privilege to help fund them? I think there's lots of different solutions, but it's not sitting idly by and it's not letting the train keep going where it's going, because it's a scary time right now for our food system. Climate angle, from a worker angle, from a power angle, all of those things are very much in our face right now.
I'm a performer
Hmm.
and I'm working on a piece about Emma Goldman, the anarchist activist from about 100 years ago.
Hmm.
And I'm learning a lot about her activism and a lot of the rights that we have today, including the 8-hour day
Hmm.
that she worked for and was imprisoned a lot for. She was working for birth control and a number
Hmm.
of things. It's really wonderful learning about her and learning about all of our history
Hmm.
that got us the benefits and the freedoms that we have today. You mentioned too, I know that one of her mentors was Peter Kropotkin. The definition of mutual aid was coined by Peter Kropotkin, a Russian anarchist philosopher who published a collection of essays titled Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution. Its
Hmm.
seminal work has inspired generations of activists and scholars who argue that his scholarship provides an alternative to a competitive capitalist worldview, one where love, cooperation, and human solidarity are at the root of
Hmm.
human nature.
Wouldn't it be wonderful if that was our guiding principles, and I think mutual aid is something that, we all engage in to some degree. And of course, those have been formalized in certain ways, but, it's also a question of labor. And that's what, part of this book, while we talk about, all of this need to build alliances and to support, efforts that are aligned with our own, we also have to think that does take labor, right? And it takes people who are doing that work. And it it is something that we can't discount, right? Even in like Food Not Bombs, or in Burlington here, it's Food Not Cops. Like, people are doing that work, and it does take work. And not to say that we don't want to support mutual aid and celebrate mutual aid, but we also have to think about who does it fall upon to do that. It's often women. It's often people who
It's
care.
us, all of us. If
Yeah,
we eat,
it should. Yeah.
it falls on all of us. Well, Teresa Mayers, thank you so much for joining me today, and to you and Laura Ann Minkoff-Zern for writing Will Work for Food, Labor Across the Food Chain. As I said at the beginning of this program, if you eat food, you need to read this book.
Thank you so much for saying that. That's what we hope.
Yeah, and I wish you the best with your release on September 23rd. I hope your book is in band.
I haven't heard that yet. I hope it isn't either.
But there's a lot of information in here that some people don't want everyone to know.
That's true. It is true, but I know copies are being mailed out now, so they will be in
Good.
the world.
Okay, because truth is power. All right, thank you and be well.
Yep, you too. Thank you so much.